This is the Ben Shapiro Show, AM 770, KTTH, KTTH.com. There are a lot of folks out there on the left, I'm sure a lot around the Seattle area that you talk to, that you have to deal with, who tell you that if you believe in God, that's because you're a fool, that science disproves the existence of God, and that more specifically, Darwinian evolution disproves the veracity of the Bible and the existence of God. Well, the person who is best known for debunking that case pretty thoroughly is Stephen Meyer. Stephen Meyer is the author of a book called Darwin's Doubt. He's also a professor who went to Cambridge University. He earned his PhD in history and philosophy of science in 1991 there at University of Cambridge. And he has become probably the best-known advocate for intelligent design, possibly on the planet at this point. Dr. Meyer joins us now here on the Ben Shapiro Show. Thanks so much for joining us.
Hey, great to be with you, Ben.
Well, why don't we start? I want to start by asking you, there are a lot of folks who, like Richard Dawkins or like Bill Maher, less informed, who like to make the case that Darwinian evolution disproves the existence of God. Well, what do you make of that critique, and where are the holes? I mean, you talk about holes in Darwinian evolution. What do you mean by Darwinian evolution, and where exactly are the biggest holes?
Yeah, a lot of good questions. Let's start with Dawkins's case, and he makes this in two famous books, The Blind Watchmaker and The God Delusion. And in The God Delusion, he argues that belief in God is essentially delusional. That's the nature of the title. And he says the reason for that is that the strongest argument for God's existence was always the presence of design in nature. But he says since Darwin, we've known that there's no evidence of actual design, only the appearance or the illusion of design. And Darwinism established the appearance of design was just an illusion because the mechanism of natural selection acting on random variations, and we would now in modern times talk about natural selection acting on random mutations, that mechanism is sufficient to produce the appearance of design without itself being designed or guided in any way. So natural selection gives you design without a designer. And if there's no evidence for an actual designer, then there's no case based on evidence for God. So you can still believe in God if you want to, but not on the basis of any kind of public evidence. It's essentially a private subjective belief. It's in Dawkins's words, delusional. Now, the problem with that argument is that the appearances of design that the Darwinian mechanism can explain away are really minimal. And his approach to the design question worked in the 19th century when biologists were fascinated with minor adaptation, finch beaks getting bigger and smaller in response to varying environmental conditions. But the mechanism has really never done a good job of explaining where we get birds in the first place or where we get animal body plans, for example. My new book, Darwin's Doubt, is about an event in the history of life known as the Cambrian explosion, where you get all the first major groups of animals coming into the fossil record, and they come in very suddenly, geologically abruptly, contrary to what you'd expect if the Darwinian mechanism were responsible. And so the Darwinian mechanism is increasingly understood by leading evolutionary biologists themselves to explain small-scale variation well, but it doesn't explain the major innovations that occur in the history of life. And therefore, we really haven't explained away the major and most striking examples or appearances of design in nature.
Dr. Meyer, one of I have so many questions for you, and it really is great to have you on the program to discuss this. I want to ask you about the New Earth movement. There are a lot of folks who are biblically based and are still insisting that the Earth is 6,000 years old and the rest of this. And then my opinion has always been that gives conservatives, religious people in general, a pretty bad name in scientific circles because the evidence is pretty clear using even things as simple as carbon dating that the universe is not 6,000 years old. How do you don't argue that biblical literalism is the solution to Darwinian evolution, and that's one of the things I like about you. How do you respond to folks who are new Earth creationists?
Well, I really think it's the wrong issue. It's not, the fundamental issue is there design or no design? It's not how long ago did the design take place. And people have made this question of the age of the Earth the central issue when it's at best a subsidiary one. My own view is that the Earth is very old, and but I see very striking evidence of design both in in physics with the fine-tuning of the laws and constants of physics that the physicists have been talking about since the 1960s, in cosmology, where we see evidence of a definite beginning to the universe, and especially in biology, where we see not only the sudden appearance of all these new major groups of animals, but we also are living in an information age in biology. Since Watson and Crick in the 1950s and right up to the present with things like the Human Genome Project, the central fact of biology that has to be explained is the primacy of digital information inside cells. Living organisms are run by information, and there are complex information processing systems inside living organisms. And everything we know from experience is that information always arises from an intelligent source. So I think we're seeing very striking evidence of intelligent design, and it really, in a sense, circumvents the whole debate about young Earth, old Earth. I personally hold to an old Earth view, but I don't think that's the central issue.
Well, we're talking with Stephen Meyer. He's the author of a book called Darwin's Doubt, which really explains why Darwinian evolution is not sufficient to essentially rule out God. Now, Dr. Meyer, one of the things that Richard Dawkins makes a big deal out of is the idea that religious folks seem to want a God of the gaps, meaning that, and the way he defines that is, if you believe in God and you believe in science, then you have to sort of put God where science is not, as though science and God are in opposition. And one of the things that you talk about in Darwin's Doubt and in all your other work is the idea that you really don't need to put science to one side to believe in an active God in the universe, that God's planning is sort of evident in even looking at science. And this is what I've never understood about kind of the Darwinian take on God. Let's say that all of that is correct. Let's say that Darwinian evolution somehow creates all of this. Even if they were correct, I'm still not sure how that rules out God. That is certainly true in a situation where, as you mentioned, there is a punctuated equilibrium. There are great leaps forward in the evolutionary structure that seem to happen all at once, not this gradual, slow climb from the slime.
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked that, Ben, because it's often asserted that the argument for intelligent design is an argument based on our ignorance of scientific advance, or it's based on gaps in our knowledge. But the argument that I'm making is not based on the absence of knowledge. It's based on everything we've learned from modern molecular biology and genetics and similar fields. The central thing that has to be explained when you see these big jumps in complexity in the history of life, and an event like the Cambrian explosion is an explosion of new biological form, lots of new animals. But to build those animals, we now know that the evolutionary process would have to generate a whole lot of new information, genetic information and other forms of hierarchically organized information. The instruction set for building the animals has to come from someplace. Now, what we know from experience is that information always arises from an intelligent source, whether we're looking at information in a hieroglyphic inscription or a computer program or a paragraph in a book. Whenever we see information, especially when it's encoded digitally, as it is in the DNA, information always arises from an intelligent source. That's part of what we know from our experience of the world. So when we see that information is running the show in biology, and that these huge infusions of new biological form in the history of life would require new infusions of information, we're looking at strong positive indicators of the activity of intelligence. We're looking at positive evidence for the activity of an intelligent designer. This isn't based upon our lack of knowledge. It's based on what we know about the cause and effect structure of the world. Information always arises from an intelligent source.
Now, Dr. Meyer, Darwin's Doubt has come under fire from a lot of folks on the left, including paleontologist Donald Prothero, as well as a review in the New Yorker from Gareth Cook, suggesting that you're working off of old information when you talk about the Cambrian explosion. That they say that it actually was a lot more gradual than you claim it to be, and they suggest that there's been new fossil discovery that sort of smooths out all of this punctuated equilibrium that you and I are talking about here. What's your response to their claims that you're just using outdated science?
Yeah, I'm also glad you asked that. My website, darwinsdoubt.com, has a very thorough response to Donald Prothero's critique. His claim is that the Cambrian explosion didn't take place in about a 10 million year window, as I claim, but it took it was about an 80 million year event. And this is really just a lot of definitional fiddling, because what Prothero does is he includes several separate events, paleontological events, in the designation Cambrian explosion. We show in the response that I've written on my website that the standard definition of the Cambrian event by leading paleontologists who are Cambrian experts is a 10 million year event with the major pulse of the what's called the diversification, the major innovations in biological form actually occurring within a more narrow 5 to 6 million year window. But it really doesn't matter if you want to redefine the Cambrian explosion as an 80 million year event and include big pulses of innovation that occurred before that and after that, and then it's just essentially a debate about semantics. What really has to be explained is what is the cause or the mechanism that could generate that amount of new biological form and the huge amount of genetic information that would be required to build it in the narrow windows in which those big pulses of innovation occur. There is a big pulse of innovation that was confined to about a 5 to 6 million year window in which about 13 to 16 new animal body plans arose. You've got to build those animals somehow. That requires new information, and the neo-Darwinian mechanism of mutation and selection is simply not sufficient to do that. The mechanism relies on essentially copying errors in DNA, and we know from computer code if you start randomly introducing errors into computer code, you're not going to generate new useful information. You're going to degrade the information you have. So there's just simply a lack of causal explanation in the Darwinian system for these major innovations in the history of life. However people want to define events like the Cambrian explosion, they can redefine it if they want to, but it doesn't get around the essential engineering problem of building these animals.
You know, my wife is at UCLA Medical School, and at UCLA Medical School, I'm an Orthodox Jew. My wife is Orthodox as well. And she confronts on a fairly regular basis the sort of militant atheism that you see so often in the scientific community. How has your book, Darwin's Doubt, been accepted in the scientific community, and why the quasi-religious fervor to avoid the presence of God in science? Why this desire to read God out of science when you know leave aside the God of the gaps, the beautiful design of evolution itself sort of suggests God?
Well, I think what's going on is that for many people, evolution defined in this materialistic way that Richard Dawkins defines it is an indispensable, it's an essential part of their worldview. Every worldview has to answer the question of the prime reality. What's the thing or the entity or the process from which everything else comes? For people who are materialists or atheists or of similar ilk, the Darwinian theory is part of their creation story. It's part of what enables them to explain all of reality in strictly material terms. So when you challenge the Darwinian theory on scientific grounds, many of them take that almost as a personal affront. You're challenging their personal belief system. And for many scientists, I think, fail to distinguish their personal belief system from science itself. So these things get mixed up, and people respond like we all do when we have an intensely felt personal belief challenged. But I think the glory of science is that we should be free to challenge long-standing theories and orthodoxies, and I think that's it's what's exciting about all these new discoveries and new developments that I discuss in the book is that really the orthodox scientific ideas about how life arose are being challenged on every front, even within evolutionary biology. The standard theory we all learn is called neo-Darwinism, the modern form of Darwinian theory, and many leading evolutionary biologists are rejecting that theory and seeking to formulate new theories of evolution precisely because they recognize that this mechanism of natural selection and random mutation is insufficient.
Now, on the other side of the argument, there are a lot of religious folks who get very uptight whenever people try to reconcile or supposedly reconcile the tenets of modern science with intelligent design, with the Bible. How's your reception been among religious Americans, many of whom get very exercised when we talk about the reality of natural selection and principles like
that? Well, these are really good questions. I think what you're getting at is that the debate heretofore has been very polarized between people who, for example, hold to a very specific reading of Genesis that says that the days of creation were short periods of time, and on the other side, the Richard Dawkins crowd that wants to say that there's no design, no purpose evident in the history of life. So they would define, so they would be strict materialists. And there's a lot of interesting positions in the middle. And intelligent design actually brings a lot of those different interesting positions together around one central claim, which is that there is evidence of design in nature. There is purpose behind whatever brought life into existence. And also you can tell by examining the evidence from the physical world, from the biological world. Inside cells, we have complex information processing systems. We have digital code. We have circuitry. We have hierarchically organized forms of information processing. These are features of high-tech systems that we know arise from one and only one type of cause, and that's intelligence. So what we think we're seeing in the biological realm is evidence for purposive intelligence in the history of life. How that played itself out, whether it worked itself out gradually in some cases or much more suddenly, those are matters for further investigation. But surely we see evidence of purpose and of design, and that, I think, brings science and faith together, and it's also based on science. It's not just a religious a priori assertion.
Well, the book is a must-read. It's called Darwin's Doubt. The author, Stephen Meyer, probably the leading intelligent design theorist, certainly in America, possibly globally. And Dr. Meyer, thanks so much for joining the Ben Shapiro Show and really clearing up. I think a lot of people have misconceptions about what exactly intelligent design is. They tend to lump it in for media purposes with the new Earth creationists or with fundamentalist interpretation of the Bible. And one of the things that has always driven me nuts as somebody who really loves science is this attempt to kind of buttonhole intelligent design into something that it is not. And thank you so much for fighting every day to prevent that buttonholing.
Hey, that's great, Ben. And I would also mention I'll be speaking at the Chabad Jewish Center in Snohomish here in Seattle on the 20th of May about these very issues. So that's another opportunity for people to explore them.
Oh, terrific. Well, we really appreciate and look forward to that. Dr. Meyer, thanks so much for joining the Ben Shapiro Show. This is the Ben Shapiro Show, AM 770, KTTH, KTTH.com.